For weeks, Ukraine has been sliding towards conflict, with Moscow-backed separatists responding to Russia's expansionist ambitions and Ukrainian nationalists looking to the West for support. But are the underlying divisions as clear as they're portrayed? Journalist Michael Anderson has worked extensively in Ukraine. We sent him to make a personal assessment of the narrative that some fear could end in partition.
Six months ago, ordinary Ukrainians took to the street when the country's president turned down closer relations with the European Union. Soon the rebellion became about the corruption of the Yanukovych regime. And in February, after his police had killed 100 people, the president had to flee. Few could then have foreseen that today Ukraine is fighting for its very survival, with its neighbor Russia threatening to intervene militarily.
В ход были пущены и террор, и убийства, и погромы. Главными исполнителями переворота стали националисты, неонацисты, русофобы и антисемиты.
A woman is holding a sign asking, "Putin, do I look like a Nazi?" And from the signs here and the thousands of comments on social media, she's clearly not the only one who sees through the Russian propaganda.
На Украине живут и будут жить миллионы русских людей, русскоязычных граждан. И Россия всегда будет защищать их интересы.
Путин говорит, что у вас проблемы.
Нет у нас проблем. Мы живем, работаем, учимся. Дети у нас учатся, институты. У нас проблем абсолютно никаких нету.
I have been coming to Ukraine for more than 15 years and I did not recognize the picture Mr. Putin, his press, but also quite a few Western media are painting of Ukrainians about to split their country apart. In March and April, I traveled from north to south, from west to east, to hear the voices of ordinary Ukrainians almost unanimously rejecting the myths and headlines about fascism and civil war.
Я обращаюсь к своему отцу в России, в Москве, ветерану Чеченской войны. Папа, не приезжай в Украину стрелять, иначе будешь стрелять в единственного своего сына.
According to some experts, there is simply no basis for talking about a civil war in Ukraine, the so-called Yugoslav scenario. Professor Natalia Chernish has for 20 years, on the basis of nationwide surveys, studied the attitude of the Ukrainians.
Practically only 7% support the idea of dividing Ukraine into two different countries, some kind of Yugoslavian variant. 95% of all respondents answer that they think that Ukraine is our motherland. 95%. The language is not so important especially for young generation. It is an instrument of manipulation, absolutely.
Many Western observers were all thinking now the East is going to go against the West and that is all going to go out of control, but that was never a threat here. The things that are happening in eastern Ukraine, these are just obviously instigated by the so-called Russian tourists, by provocateurs.
Ethnic Russians and Ukrainians do not have a history of conflict, and religious differences play little role, illustrated on the Maidan when the leaders of all faiths, including the Russian Orthodox Church, united. According to Andreas Umland and other leading experts, some Western media and politicians are playing straight into Putin's hands.
They suggest historical references that are simply not there and that create a panic and that can be then used by Russia for military invasion. And unfortunately, there are now a lot of politicians in the West who also use these heavily loaded terms, and that is a play with fire.
Many of the leaders of the revolution have now become part of the new Ukrainian government. And as their first step, they tried to downgrade the use of the Russian language, but this was vetoed by the interim president.
Yeah, it was a tactical mistake. It's clearly the wrong moment. The political elite here, it turns out that they're not that smart, and I'm just surprised how stupid they are.
Слава Украине! Я уверен, что мы должны сегодня объединиться, независимо от любых признаков, вокруг единой идеи Украины. Слава Украине! Россия! 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 Председатель Совета министров Автономной Республики Крым
Здравствуйте, дорогие крымчане! Мы с вами сегодня можем стать форпостом русского мира сегодня на территории Украины.
Мне мужу было 3 года, мне 4,5. Когда мы остались круглыми сиротами, отцы наши сложили жизнь за нашу родину, за Россию. Сынок, все.
То есть вы здесь родились, да?
А? Ну, конечно. Наши деды и прадеды здесь родились. Все.
Крым – историческая родина России.
Господин Обама, когда он говорит, что это нелегитимный референдум...
Они же все будут говорить. Им же, вы знаете прекрасно, им же надо сюда ввести свои, как говорится, войска, все.
When we had landed in Crimea, it was still part of Ukraine. By the time we would leave, it was Russia. In mid-March, 97%, officially at least, voted in favor of joining Russia, and soon after Crimea was annexed. The Ukrainian claim to Crimea is possibly less clear-cut than often assumed. In 1954, Crimea was transferred from the Russian to the Ukrainian part of the Soviet Union as a gift by the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev, himself an ethnic Ukrainian and, so the story goes, drunk when he signed. When I meet Andrei Malkin, director of the History Museum in Simferopol, but in reality one of the political architects of the new leadership here, history is the first thing he brings up.
Будучи русским регионом, где большая часть населения говорила на русском языке и ассоциировала себя с русской культурой, не вызывало каких-то проблем и противоречий, потому что и Украина, и Россия находились в составе Советского Союза, но в советское время Крым был регионом, куда вкладывались очень большие деньги. Это была такая витрина советского социализма.
И все это бесплатно.
А попав в Украину, Крым стал таким заурядным регионом, куда украинское правительство не особенно хотело вкладывать средства, вкладывать деньги. Это породило большие проблемы и социальные, и экономические, и национальные.
This was a strange invasion by stealth, few shots and almost no resistance. And a demonstration with maybe 5,000 out of 1 million ethnic Russians here was somewhat underwhelming. Close by at a pro-Ukrainian demonstration near the statue of the national poet Shevchenko, there was only a couple of hundred people. I met up with Olga Dubnich, a local sociologist. It is correct that ethnic Russians make up 60% of the population here, Olga told me, but the picture is more complicated than what you get from the media.
We should differentiate, because we have old people who now in their 14 or 15 years, and they remember how it was in 90s in Crimea, and they remember USSR times when the Russian identity was very strong. And for them, it's really a big event in their life. It's a big happy event. But Russian young people, they also afraid about going to Russian Federation. For my question why, they say that we're really afraid to lose our freedom.
Opinion polls from 2013 show that even amongst the Russians here, only little more than half actually want Crimea to belong to Russia. In front of the parliament, protected so-called by Russian Cossacks, I meet a group of young people.
I'm scared to stay in Ukraine now. They want to forbid Russian language in Russian-speaking regions. And they knew how Crimea and Russian-speaking region would react to it, why they did it.
И люди боятся, люди просто стали бояться. Украина же угрожает, что она пришлет сюда своих правый сектор, вот эти нацисты. Мы надеемся, что как-то и народ все-таки опять будет Украина, Белоруссия, Россия, один народ.
Clearly, not everybody agreed with the Cossack.
Все вранье, не надо нас защищать, надо. Мы хотим Украину.
Все?
Я крымская татарка. Мы хотим жить на Украине.
Вы хотите развязать войну?
Нет, нет, мы не хотим войны. Мы хотим, чтобы забрали все эти войска российские и ушли отсюда.
In 1944, Stalin deported all Tatars from Crimea to Central Asia. More than 100,000 died, leading to the understandable mistrust between the Tatars and the Kremlin, as we had witnessed a few weeks earlier on the Maidan in Kiev.
Путин, не забывай, что внутри твоей страны находится огромный мусульманский анклав. Если хоть одна капля крови, хоть один волосок упадет с мусульман Крыма, Москва очень об этом пожалеет.
The next day we set out on the short trip to Sevastopol and arrived in the Soviet Union circa 1983. It was like being back in the Cold War. Only this time the flags were Russian. Ever since it was conquered by Catherine the Great in 1783, Sevastopol has been one of Russia's most important ports. Today it is inhabited by active and retired Soviet and Russian Navy officers.
Пожалуйста. Возвращаемся домой в Россию.
The new Russian authorities had warned us not to film, but we soon found the Russian Navy, which in a couple of days in March had conquered their totally unprepared Ukrainian counterparts. It was time to go to Western Ukraine and see if we could find these Russian-hating extreme nationalists we'd heard so much about.
Слава Україні! Але ті москалі лізуть і лізуть. Владимир Владимирович, неужели ты веришь в эту сказку? Присядь в автобус, приедь во Львов, посмотри наш прекрасный лучший город в мире.
We went to meet the team behind the video. They run a restaurant with a peculiar theme of Ukrainian partisans and nationalists in the 1930s and 40s.
Гасло.
Слава Україні.
Героям слава. Не москалик?
Конечно, нет.
Слава Україні.
Героям слава.
We're trying to say to the Putin that, do you really believe in this? Stop this. Stop lying. 500,000 people, they have look on this TV spot on YouTube. The main idea is to show our real history.
Ukrainian partisans and nationalists are a controversial topic. Many Russians see them as brutal Nazi collaborators who killed Soviet soldiers and Jews, while many Ukrainians see them as freedom fighters against Soviet occupation. Their leader was called Stepan Bandera, and even today Russian media use the derogatory term Banderovцы to describe them.
When the people, they have no choice. They were fighting because the people were killing them.
There are lots of people who connect Bandera with fascism, with killing of Jews.
That's another path of myth.
Намерены в дальнейшем делать украинские идейные наследники Бандеры, приспешника Гитлера во время Второй мировой войны.
But amidst the flowers and the children's tributes, flashes of something more sinister. It's the right that appears to be coming out on top.
Andreas Umland, an internationally recognized expert on right-wing movements, makes it clear who and what Bandera and his group were. But he stresses that there is a big difference between Ukrainian nationalism historically and today.
The Bandera wing was an ultra-nationalist organization, ethnocentrist, xenophobic, anti-Semitic. Most who think of Bandera today prefer not to remember these problematic aspects of the history. But I wouldn't overinterpret it. I think it is not an expression of widespread fascism. They've lost here between 5 and 8 million people because of fascism.
A heated exchange between two respected broadcasters from the same network illustrates the complexity of the issue.
We just, as a network, have to be really careful not to lump the entire pro-European Ukrainians into what may well be, which are nationalistic and extremist. So that's all I'm saying.
Importantly, opinion polls say that at the election on the 25th of May, the nationalists will get less than 10% of the votes. Yurko's aim is that the many tourists from Russia and eastern Ukraine who eat at his restaurant will leave with a better sense of the difference between the past and the present.
Now we can speak about this history with a smile. So we can survive it.
Так, фотографія з москалем, 10 гривень, з мертвим 20. Наша кума не долуга. Так, сідай, москалику.
Тоже москалик, да?
Тоже любиш Путіна, да?
It is striking how quickly Lviv, which in contrast to most of Ukraine was occupied by the Soviets only in 1939, has refound its European roots. At the same time, Bandera and partisan merchandise is readily available.
И это миф, как бы, что здесь ходят, как говорят, страшные бандеровцы и бьют тех, кто говорит на русском языке.
Приезжайте во Львов, разговаривайте на русском, то есть никаких проблем нету. Бандера, он боролся за независимость Украины. Одни вещи он хорошо делал, другие не очень, то есть это очень противоречивая личность.
Восток и Запад, то есть должны быть, вместе.
Почему?
Потому что Украина неделима, то есть мы один народ.
Based on her nationwide surveys over 20 years, Professor Natalia Chanish shows that, contrary to what the media say, East and West Ukraine are in fact becoming more and more alike. Only a small percentage actually want Eastern Ukraine to unite with Russia.
Among young people, it's only 5%. Maybe they live in the western part or eastern part of Ukraine. It doesn't matter. They all together support the idea of strong, independent Ukraine. Language is not so important for them.
And despite the increasing instability in the east, where pro-Russian gunmen are taking over government buildings, Natalia Chanish confidently predicts that Putin will not manage to split Ukraine.
He is a loser from the beginning because he forget about this special kind of Ukrainian as a country and Ukrainians as a citizens, including the partisan war.
In the evening, there was a memorial for all those who died in the fighting on the Maidan in February. The extreme nationalist group, the Right Sector, which we'd heard so much about in Crimea and in the media, also has a few tents and young men here.
Не фашисти, не нацисти, а українські націоналісти. Українська нація домінант, але інші нації можуть існувати разом з нами, і російськоязичні.
Ни одной семьи вы не найдете, представителей, которые не были бы на Майдане. Выезжали семьями, собирали деньги, лекарства, все, чем надо было, помогали. Вот люди просто отдавали все, и, конечно, очень много погибло.
The mayor had made a video in Russian explaining to people in the eastern part of Ukraine that what they hear on Russian TV is a fabrication.
В последнее время вас, наверное, часто пугали, что вооруженные экстремисты, западенцы...
Нет, это, конечно, это выгода нашим врагам. Потому что, но если смотреть, что сегодня на украинской земле российская армия, которая оккупировала Крым, конечно, им выгодно, чтобы Украина ссорилась между собой. Здесь используется очень сильная пропаганда. Геббельс отдыхает.
There was a distinct lack of extremists around the oddly enormous monument for Stepan Bandera, so reviled in Russian media.
This myth that people here in Lviv are extreme nationalists, gun-toting, running around in the streets trying to find Russians and Russian-speaking people to kill, it is just that, it's a myth. It's invented by Putin's propaganda, and it is unfortunately also too often being peddled by some of my Western colleagues who ought to know better.
We drove the 1,000 kilometers to the increasingly restive east to meet a famous footballer who, with his colleagues from all over Ukraine, had participated in a film with the aim of uniting the country.
Нас объединяет любовь к футболу.
Мы, футболисты, мы играем по всей Украине. Нигде не чувствовали разъединения украинского народа. Средства массовой информации сильно нагнетают обстановку вокруг Украины. Я знаю украинский и русский, какая разница, но я украинец.
The fact is, however, that all the jokes about Putin and his civic initiatives have not managed to stabilize Ukraine. At the beginning of May, the interim government outright admitted that Kiev has lost control of the east and that a civil war threatens. The propaganda and the myth seem to have had their negative impact.
Украина проиграла информационную войну. Ну, собственно говоря, и уровень жизни, и отдаленность от всей остальной Украины, приближенность к границам России. Люди немножко живут в прошлом веке.
This region was the center of Soviet heavy industry, explained Surab, and many here lost everything when the Soviet Union broke down. Even after this pro-Ukrainian demonstrator was already badly injured, seemingly ordinary passers-by attacked him.
Такого момента не было никогда. Самая большая моя претензия к России, что она в моем городе из людей вытащила самое дерьмо, которое в них есть, и выплеснула это наружу.
The question is not whether Russia will annex eastern Ukraine, says Surab, but how.
Насколько эта интервенция станет из аннексии Крыма, например, станет интервенцией военной. Пока что, как видите, все так вот на балансе.
Under the Lenin statue, I find the bitterness Surab talked about.
С бандеровцами мы жить не хотим.
Какие бандеровцы?
Западной Украины.
Там многие наши погибли деды. Меня дядька погиб. Он
они
не просто
были фашистами,
погиб.
они остались.
Убили, его казнили живьем.
Если завтра сюда придет Россия своей армией, ни одна рука не поднимется против.
Уйдите с Украины, вернее с Харькова. Будьте добры, уйдите с Харькова. Нет, вообще, уйдите с Харькова. Мы живем здесь нормально, у нас все хорошо.
Even after the troubles flared up, opinion polls conducted by the National University show that even here in the eastern heartlands, less than 1 in 10 young people want the region to go to Russia.
Я родился, когда Украина уже была независима, это моя родина. Я не хочу, чтобы она была частью России.
Фашистов, в общем-то, ни одного не видел. Почему меня не бьют за русский язык? Студенты, в общем-то, интеллигенция в основном поддерживают точку зрения, что Россию нам не надо.
What we're looking at here in eastern Ukraine is a constant day-to-day slow conflict of interest, where the weapons are Russian money, Russian media, and basically Russian manipulation of the people who live here. The future of the country will to a large extent depend on whether the Ukrainians are able to see the myth and propaganda for what they are.
Putin, go home! Putin, go home! Putin, go home!